The soil was still warm when I opened my eyes. Not the warmth of sunlight, the warmth of fresh earth, packed tight around my shoulders, my arms, my face. The warmth of a grave dug in haste by people who were in a hurry to celebrate. I could hear them above me. Laughter, the clink of goblets, someone singing. My name spoken aloud in past tense. She was, she used to, she always. As if I were already a memory they had made their peace with. I want you to understand something before this story begins. I do not cry. I have not cried since I was 9 years old, and learned that tears only teach people exactly where to press to hurt you. What was done to me, by the people who were supposed to be my blood, my protection, my home, would have broken most women. It nearly broke me. My own pack buried me alive. The elders I had served without question, the Alpha I had bled for. They wrapped me in a shroud, lowered me into the sacred grove, and covered me with the dark earth, because my wolf frightened them, because they could not control what they could not understand, because silencing me was easier than admitting what I was. 14 years they had been poisoning me, herbs in my tea, powder ground into my food, slow, patient, deliberate erasure of the one part of me they feared they could not kill. What they never understood, what no one who has never truly been silenced can ever understand, is that a wolf does not die from being buried. She waits, she gathers. And when the earth above her finally cracks, she does not crawl out. She erupts. I press my palms flat against the dark. Every fingernail, every breath, every last piece of strength I had left. And I started to dig. The first thing I understood about death, real death, the kind that gets close enough to breathe on you, is that it is not dramatic. There was no flash of light, no voice from the heavens, no moment of crystalline clarity where the meaning of everything revealed itself in a single, merciful breath. There was only dirt in my mouth, the distant sound of celebration, and a choice. My arms were pinned close to my body, wrapped in the burial shroud they had dressed me in, white linen, insultingly clean, as though they had wanted to present me to whatever afterlife they believed in with some semblance of dignity, after spending 14 years offering me none. I could feel the weight of the earth above my chest, not crushing, not yet, but present, insistent, a reminder. You are not supposed to be awake. But I was awake, and I was furious. I worked my right arm free first. It took longer than it should have. The ground was dense, compacted by boots that had walked over me without ceremony, and by the time I had it loose, my shoulder was screaming, and my fingers were bleeding at every knuckle. I did not stop. I pressed my palm flat against the ceiling of dark earth above me, felt it give slightly, and pushed. The soil shifted. A small cascade of dirt rained down onto my face. I turned my head, kept my mouth closed, kept breathing through my nose in the slow, measured rhythm I had taught myself years ago, when the panic attacks would come in the night, and I had no one to sit beside me until they passed. In through the nose, hold, out through the mouth. You have survived worse than this. Had I? I tried to think of something worse, and found myself almost laughing. A hysterical, private, absolutely silent laugh that shook my shoulders and scattered more dirt from the ceiling above me. I pushed again. Harder. The earth moved. I do not know how long it took. Time becomes unreliable when you are fighting your way out of the ground inch by inch, your lungs burning with every breath, your mind insisting very calmly that you are going to fail, that you should simply stop, that the sensible thing, the quiet thing, would be to close your eyes and let the dark have you. I have never been particularly interested in doing the sensible thing. When my hand finally broke the surface, when my fingers closed around a fistful of cool night air, I made a sound that I am grateful no one heard. It was not a triumphant sound. It was not the sound of a woman who has conquered something. It was the raw, involuntary sound of a creature that has been underground for too long and has just remembered what breathing is supposed to feel like. I pulled myself out, slowly, agonizingly, every muscle in my body announcing its protest in language that required no translation. I rolled onto my back on the surface of the sacred grove and lay there, staring up at a sky so full of stars it seemed almost offensive, too beautiful, too indifferent, too completely unconcerned with the fact that I had just clawed my way out of my own grave. The sacred grove was silent around me. The ancient silver-bark trees rose on every side, their pale trunks glowing faintly in the moonlight, their roots so deep they were said to touch the bones of the earth itself. The elders had chosen this place deliberately. They always did everything deliberately. From somewhere beyond the tree line, back toward the pack settlement, perhaps half a mile through the dark, I could still hear the celebration. Music now. Someone had brought out the drums. My hands were shaking. I looked at them, filthy, bleeding, nails broken to the quick, and I watched them shake for a moment with a kind of detached curiosity, as though they belonged to someone else. Then I pressed them flat against the cool moss beneath me and held them still. I do not cry. I breathed. I thought about Elder Marin, her narrow face and her exact hands, and the way she had looked at me this morning before they drugged the tea. Not with hatred. That was what I had never been able to reconcile. She had not looked at me with hatred when she gave the order. She had looked at me the way a measured woman looks at a problem she has been patient about for a very long time, and is finally resolving. Clinical, satisfied. I thought about Alpha Dawn, our pack alpha, a big, slow-minded man whose authority rested entirely on the council's tolerance, standing at the edge of the grove as they lowered me in, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes on the middle distance. Not watching, not wanting to watch. I thought about every member of the pack who had stood in that grove tonight and said nothing. I stored every face, every name, every averted gaze. And then I stood up. I had nothing. That was the first practical problem. No shoes. The linen burial shroud on my back. 2 broken hands, and lungs that still tasted of soil. Half a mile between me and the pack settlement, which was absolutely not an option. And somewhere in the dark around me, probably closer than I wanted to think about, the grove's perimeter wardens would be doing their rounds. The elders were thorough women. They would have posted wardens. Not to watch for me. They had not expected me to be a problem. But because the Sacred Grove security protocols ran on a schedule that Marin had not bothered to suspend for one burial. I had perhaps 20 minutes before the first warden circled back. I took stock of what I had instead of what I didn't. My mind, intact and angrier than it had ever been, which felt like an asset. My body, damaged but functional. My wolf, and here I stopped, and I held my breath, and I reached inward with the tentative movement of someone pressing a bruise to see if it still hurts. She was there. She was there. Not silent, not suppressed, not the muffled, distant presence I had spent 14 years straining to hear through the fog of their poison, but present, vivid, enormous. Like a room I had been standing outside of my entire life, and someone had finally removed the door. Her name was Solrin, and she was ancient, and she was furious, and she had been waiting longer than I had words for. She communicated in something older than language, in sensation, in heat, in the quality of warmth that moves through a body when something long denied finally returns. Right now, she communicated in steady, spreading heat. A slow warmth that started at the base of my spine and moved outward through my limbs, knitting something together as it went. The bleeding at my knuckles slowed. The scream in my shoulder dropped to a murmur. So that is what you can do. A surge of warmth moved through my chest, impatient, almost amused. The heat of a wolf who had been trying to show me for years and was only now being given the chance. I almost smiled. I didn't, but almost. I turned away from the pack settlement and walked into the dark. I walked for what felt like hours. The forest beyond the sacred grove's eastern boundary was old growth, the kind of ancient, dense woodland that has never been cleared, never been managed, where the trees grow so close together that the canopy blocks the stars entirely and the darkness is absolute and layered. Most wolves avoided it. The stories about what lived in the deep wood had been cultivated carefully over generations, a useful deterrent for pack members who might otherwise wander. I had always suspected the stories were exaggerated. I was correct. The old-growth forest was simply dark and cold and relentlessly, indifferently still. Nothing lived here that wanted to hurt me. Everything that lived here was simply trying to survive the same as I was, minding its own business, uninterested in the barefoot woman in a burial shroud, bleeding through the undergrowth at midnight. The cold was the real problem. The linen shroud was not built for warmth. It had been built for the aesthetics of burial, and aesthetics rarely overlap with practicality. The night air in the old growth pressed against my skin like water, and by the time I had been walking for an hour, my teeth were set against each other, and my body had devoted most of its available resources to the simple project of generating heat. Solrin helped where she could, but she was 14 years out of practice, slowly burning through the last residue of their poison, and even she had limits. I kept walking. I found the stream by sound first, a low, persistent murmur somewhere to my left, threading between the roots of the old trees. I changed direction without thinking. Water meant orientation. In the Sylvain territory's eastern reaches, every stream eventually fed into the Ashevale River, the natural boundary that divided Sylvain pack land from the territory to the east. The Ashevale territory. I had heard the name my entire life, the way you hear the name of something dangerous, spoken carefully, peripherally, never lingered on. The elders did not discuss Ashevale directly. They discussed it the way you discuss a wound, with the minimum information necessary and a clear preference that everyone stop touching it. What I knew was this. The Ashevale territory was sovereign, answerable to no pack council, no continental authority, no agreement older than 20 years. It had been made sovereign by force approximately 3 decades ago, when its current ruler had been roughly 20 years old and had apparently decided that the existing political structure was not to his satisfaction. His name was Caelan Drav. 3 kingdoms paid him tribute, not because he had asked, because it was cheaper than the alternative. The Sylvain elders had a particular quality of silence reserved for his name. The silence of people who are very careful not to make noise in the direction of something that might hear them. I reached the stream, crouched at its edge, and drank. The water was ice cold and tasted of stone and pine. I splashed it on my face, scrubbed the worst of the grave dirt from my hands, and looked at my reflection in the dark mirror of the water's surface. A ghost looked back at me. Wide eyes, pale face streaked with earth, hair tangled with leaves and root. The burial shroud pale against the dark behind me. I looked exactly like what I was. A woman who had just come back from the dead. Good, I thought. Let them all think I'm a ghost. Ghosts are harder to bury twice. And if you're listening to this right now, if something about this story has already wrapped itself around your chest and won't let go, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Subscribe to Noctaria Tales and turn on your notifications so you never miss a story. Now, let's go back to Serenova. I do not know exactly when I crossed the boundary. There was no marker, no fence, no stone, no territorial line scratched into the earth. The boundary between Sylvain and Ashvale was defined by the river on the maps, but the river curved in the old growth, and in the dark, following the stream as I was, I had not realised when the stream joined the river's tributary, or when the tributary had taken me south of the formal crossing point. I only knew I had crossed when Solrin went still. Not still in the way she had been still for 14 years, suppressed and distant and struggling. Still the way a wolf goes still when she scents something massive in the dark. Every sense sharpened to a single razor edge. The fur along her spine rising slowly, in the particular way that is not aggression, that is recognition. I stopped walking. The forest around me was the same forest, same ancient trees, same cold, same layered darkness. But the quality of the air had changed in a way I could not name. Heavier, somehow, charged, the way the atmosphere feels in the moments before a storm, when the pressure drops and every living thing holds its breath. A pulse of heat moved through my chest, deep, directional, pressing forward. Solrin, pressing toward whatever she had sensed in the dark ahead. Insistent. Certain. I pressed back. Not yet. We don't know what that is. Another surge of warmth, broader this time, almost impatient. The heat of something that knows exactly what it has found, and cannot understand why I am hesitating. I took 3 more steps. My legs gave out. It was not dramatic. Nothing about that moment was dramatic. My body had simply done the arithmetic. Hours of walking, the trauma of the burial, the blood loss from my hands, the cold, and arrived at a conclusion I had not been consulted on. My knees hit the ground. My hands followed. I stayed there on all fours in the dark, breathing, staring at the forest floor, having a low, intensely private argument with my own body about whether this was strictly necessary. My body was not interested in the argument. I sat back, pressed my spine against the nearest tree, a massive old silverbark, its roots broad and curved around me almost like a cradle, and pulled my knees to my chest. The cold was significant now, not merely uncomfortable, but deliberate, pressing into my core with the focused intent of something that wanted something from me. Get up, I told myself. I did not get up. Solrin was still on alert, still facing whatever she had sensed in the dark ahead. But she was not afraid. That was the thing I kept returning to. In 14 years, the closest I had come to reading her was through the fear. The terror was always louder than anything else, bleeding through the poison's fog. But right now, with the poison finally, fully gone, what she was feeling was not fear. It was something else entirely. Something I didn't have a name for yet. My eyes were getting heavy. I knew what that meant. I had read enough about exposure and cold and blood loss to recognize the particular seductive quality of that heaviness. The way it tries to present itself as rest, as peace, as something earned and deserved. It was none of those things. It was the cold making its final argument. You should sleep, it said. You really should not, I replied. My eyes closed anyway. I heard the howl from very far away. Or perhaps it was close. Distance had become difficult to calculate. I was somewhere between waking and not, my back against the silverbark tree, the cold having mostly made its case. When the sound came rolling through the old-growth forest, like the deep reverberation of a bell. One single howl. Long, controlled, utterly without urgency. Not a hunting call, not a distress signal, not the communal howl of a pack running together under a full moon. This was something else. This was a declaration. The sound of something enormous reminding the dark that it was there. Not out of insecurity, not out of aggression, simply because it was, and because silence is a thing that belongs to whoever decides to break it. Deep inside me, Solrin answered. Private. Devastating. Not heat this time. Something steadier than heat. A low, bone-deep warmth that moved outward from the centre of my chest in every direction simultaneously. The warmth of something that has been searching for its correct position for a very long time, and has just found it. Mate. Not words. Certainty. I tried to open my eyes. They were very heavy. The cold had its arms around me now, and cold is patient, and I was out of arguments. The last things I registered before the darkness fully arrived. The sound of footsteps in the undergrowth. Unhurried, deliberate. The gait of something that has never needed to move cautiously, because caution implies the existence of a threat. The scent of pine smoke, and cold iron, and something dark and warm underneath. Cedar, perhaps, or something older than cedar, something the trees here might have recognized and bent slightly toward, without knowing why. A voice, low, deliberate, carrying the quality of a man who has never once in his life raised it to be heard, because the alternative has always been available, and infinitely more effective. He said 2 words. I did not hear them clearly. The dark had finished making its argument, but I felt them. Felt the sound of them move through the cold air and reach me at the base of the silverbark tree where I had folded myself, like something the forest had found and decided to keep. Whatever he said, my wolf, ancient, furious, 14 years suppressed, freshly resurrected, went completely quiet. Not in fear, in something that felt absurdly, impossibly, like relief. And I let the dark take me. The first thing I registered was warmth. Not the desperate, hard-won warmth of a body fighting to keep itself alive. Not the thin, conditional warmth of the Sylvain pack hall, where the fire was always built for the ranked wolves, and the heat reached the rest of us as an afterthought. This was warmth that filled a room. Settled warmth. The kind that had been present long enough to soak into the walls, and the floorboards, and the heavy curtains drawn against the night. The kind that said this fire was built deliberately, and built for here, and built for now. I opened my eyes. The ceiling above me was dark timber, old, smoke-seasoned beams running the width of a room that was larger than any I had ever slept in. The bed beneath me was unreasonable. That was the only word I had for it. A bed of such considered, unapologetic comfort that simply lying in it felt like a position I had not earned and could not explain. I sat up slowly. My hands had been cleaned and wrapped. Linen bandaging, neat and tight, the work of someone who knew what they were doing, and had done it without waking me. My burial shroud was gone. In its place I was wearing a shirt, man's linen, oversized, falling to my thighs. Practical, unsentimental. Not a violation, but a decision made by someone who understood the difference between those two things. I looked at the room. stone walls, a fireplace broad enough to stand in, burning low and steady, casting amber light across a floor covered in dark rugs. A heavy door, closed. A window to my left, its curtains thick but not quite meeting, a thread of cold night air finding the gap and curling into the warmth like a question. A chair near the fire that bore the quality of a chair that someone had recently been sitting in and had recently stood up from. A table beside the bed, a cup of water, a small plate, bread, something dark and soft beside it. Not elaborate, sufficient. I drank the water before I had consciously decided to. My body made that decision on its own, and I allowed it, because I had spent enough energy arguing with my body in the last several hours, and I was choosing my battles. Then I looked at the door. Then I looked at the window. Then I assessed what I had. The wrapped hands, the borrowed shirt, the bare feet, the wolf inside me who was awake and watchful, radiating a steady, low warmth I was still not accustomed to, and I made my calculations. I got out of bed. The floor was cold through my bare feet. I moved to the window first, drew the curtain back an inch, and looked out. I was high up, second floor, perhaps third. Below was a courtyard, torchlit, enormous. Stone walls on every side, rising to battlements where I could see the silhouettes of guards moving in the measured, purposeful rhythm of a patrol that ran on precision rather than habit. Beyond the walls, the dark shapes of forest and mountain, peaks I did not recognize, positioned in relation to the stars in ways that confirmed what I had already suspected. I was not in Sylvain territory. I was deep in Ashvale. I stood at that window for a long moment and let that settle into me the way cold settles, thoroughly, finding every corner. The Sylvain elders' voices were in my head without invitation. Ashvale, Drav, you do not want to be noticed by that territory. You do not want to be noticed by that man. Solrin was completely untroubled by this information. A pulse of warmth moved through my chest, steady, content, unhurried. Almost something like amusement, if warmth could carry amusement. I found that either very reassuring or very concerning, and had not yet decided which. I let the curtain fall and turned back to the room. The man standing at the fireplace had not been there when I woke up. He was there now. He was not looking at me. That was the first thing. He was standing with his back partially to the room, one forearm resting on the mantelpiece, his gaze on the fire, and his posture had the quality of someone who was entirely aware of everything happening behind them and has simply chosen to give it a moment. He was tall in a way that adjusted the dimensions of the room. Not aggressively. He was not performing it, not filling the space with deliberate dominance the way ranked males in the Sylvain pack always had, always desperate to remind everyone of what they were. He simply occupied the room the way an old tree occupies a forest, without effort, without apology, as a simple fact of what is. Dark clothing, practical, fine quality but unadorned. Dark hair. The firelight caught the line of his jaw, the strong column of his neck, the breadth of his shoulders. He did not look like a man who paid tribute to anyone. He looked like the reason kingdoms developed the concept of tribute in the first place. I stayed exactly where I was, near the window, and I said nothing. I had learned young that silence is information. Who fills it, how quickly, with what? And I wanted to see what kind of man he was before I gave him a single word to work with. The fire crackled. Outside, a guard's boots crossed the courtyard below. He spoke without turning. His voice was low and deliberate, carrying the complete absence of any need to convince anyone of anything. A voice that had never been raised, not because its owner was patient, but because it had never been necessary. He told me I had been awake for 4 minutes. I asked if he was counting. He turned then. I had been prepared for dangerous. I had not been prepared for this. His face was the face of a man who had looked at every difficult thing the world had to offer and had found none of it particularly surprising. Sharp features, dark eyes. Not black, I realized as he turned fully toward the firelight. A deep, particular brown, the color of timber in old-growth forests, of earth before it is disturbed. There were lines at the corners of those eyes that had not been put there by laughter. He looked at me the way a man looks at something he has already assessed once, thoroughly, and is now reassessing with the knowledge of what he found the first time. Not with hunger. Not with a particular kind of male attention I had spent my life navigating, the attention that immediately begins calculating what it can take. This was something more careful than that, more serious. He was reading me, and he was making no effort to pretend otherwise. He told me his men counted. Habit. He moved away from the fireplace, not toward me, but to the table beside the bed, where he picked up the plate I had ignored and set it on the chair nearest the fire, closer to the warmth. He told me to eat something. Not a request, not quite a command. The tone of a man who has assessed the situation, identified the logical next step, and sees no reason to package it in social niceties. I looked at the plate. I looked at him. I asked who had cleaned my hands. He said he had. I let that sit for a moment and asked why. Something moved across his face, not quite an expression, more the shadow of one. He said it was because they needed cleaning, and because I was not going to be useful to anyone with an infection setting into both palms. Useful, I repeated. He told me to sit down, that I was cold. I was not going to tell him he was right. I sat down. The bread was good, heavier than I was used to, dense with something seeded, still faintly warm, which meant it had been brought recently. The dark, soft thing beside it was a preserve of some kind, rich and slightly bitter, and I ate it without being able to name it, and found I didn't care. He stood at the fireplace again. His back was not fully to me now, angled, so that I was in his peripheral vision without being directly in his gaze, as though he had decided on a measured level of attention and was holding to it precisely. I ate. The fire was warm. Solrin was a steady, low presence at the back of my mind, awake, watchful, radiating something impossible that I was not going to acknowledge. "Stop it," I told her privately. She did not stop it. I finished eating, set the plate down, and asked him directly whether I was a prisoner. He was quiet for a moment. Not the stillness of someone considering a lie, the stillness of someone being exact with language. "No," he said. "Then I could leave," I told him. He said I could try. I was barefoot, mildly concussed, and 10 miles from the nearest settlement that was not his territory. I could leave, he said. He wouldn't stop me. A pause. The forest, he added, might have opinions. I studied the side of his face and told him that was a very elaborate way of saying I could not leave. It was an accurate way of saying the choice was mine, and so were its consequences, he said. He didn't keep prisoners. He had no use for them. I asked what he did have use for. A long pause. Those dark eyes held mine without urgency, without performance. That, he said, depended entirely on what I was. The fire settled, a slow cascade of embers shifting in the grate. I held his gaze, and I thought about how to answer that. What to give him, what to keep, how much truth was safe in a room I didn't know, with a man whose reputation I had been hearing whispered over since childhood. I don't know yet, I said finally. It was the most honest answer I had. Something in his expression shifted, barely, the way deep water shifts when something large moves far below the surface. He looked at me for a long moment, not with pity, which I would not have tolerated, with the focused attention of someone filing information away with great care. He looked at the burial shroud I had been wearing and said the word like a question that wasn't one. Then he said, "My pack." "Yes," I said. Another silence. He asked how long. I knew what he meant. Not how long I had been in the ground, how long they had been doing what they were doing. 14 years, I said. The only sign that this landed anywhere was the slight tightening of his jaw. A single, controlled movement, quickly released. He asked about my wolf. I held his gaze. "Present," I said, and extremely irritated. This time something did cross his face. Brief, controlled, gone before it fully arrived, but I caught it. Almost. Almost the shadow of something that, on a different face, might have been called amusement. He turned back to the fire and told me to sleep, that I was staying until my hands had healed. After that, we would discuss what I was and what happened next. I told him he didn't get to make that decision for me. He agreed, without heat, without any trace of wounded ego, simply agreeing with a statement of fact. He wasn't making a decision, he said. He was telling me what he intended to discuss. The decision was mine. He moved toward the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. "The room locks from the inside," he said. "I should use it if it made me feel safer." He said it without implication, not as a warning, not as an invitation, simply an option offered without pressure. I said, before I had made the conscious choice to, that he didn't frighten me. He stopped at the door. He did not turn around. He told me he knew, and then, very quietly, that was why I was in the good room. He was gone before I could decide what to do with that. The door closed. I sat in the firelight and the warmth for a long time, my clean wrapped hands folded in my lap, my wolf a warm and infuriatingly contented presence humming at the base of my sternum. "Don't," I told her. She hummed louder. I looked at the fire he had built, or ordered built, or simply expected would be built upon his return, for a woman he had found unconscious at his border in a burial shroud. I thought about how the plate had been moved, closer to the warmth, without comment, without drawing attention to the gesture. He always notices when she is cold. I did not know why that specific thought arrived in my mind with the quality of a warning. I filed it away, pressed it flat, covered it with more important things, escape routes, timelines, the question of what Elder Marin would do when she discovered the grove was empty. How long before she sent someone? How long before someone arrived at Ashvale's border with a legal claim and a polite smile and 14 years of measured cruelty folded into a diplomatic document? I had survived the ground. The politics would be harder. I got up, moved to the door, and turned the lock. Then I stood there with my hand on the old iron and understood, slowly, that I had locked it not to keep him out. I had locked it because it was the first door I had ever been permitted to lock from the inside. And I did not know what to do with that either. I went back to the bed. I lay down in the unreasonable warmth, and I stared at the ceiling beams, and I listened to the fire breathe. I do not cry, I reminded myself. I didn't. But for the first time in 14 years, lying in a locked room with a fire built deliberately and a plate moved 2 feet closer to the warmth by hands that had also cleaned mine, for the first time in a very long time, I understood what the absence of crying was costing me. I closed my eyes. Outside, the Ashvale forest was dark and ancient and completely unconcerned. And somewhere below me, in a castle that 3 kingdoms feared, a man who had never once needed to raise his voice was standing in a corridor. deciding something that neither of us had the language for yet. Solren settled her weight low and deep and still, and for the first time in 14 years, she slept. I woke before the sun, old habit. In the Sylvain pack, the ranked wolves took the morning hours for themselves, the warmth of the hall, the first food, the undisturbed quiet. Everyone else learned early that the best version of any day was the part that happened before the ranked wolves remembered you existed. For a long moment I lay completely still, cataloguing the ceiling above me, the quality of the dark, the sounds of a building in its quietest hour, the distant shift of a guard's weight on stone, the low breath of the fire burning itself down to coals, the wind finding the gap in the curtain and making its small, cold argument. Then I took stock of myself. My hands first. I unwrapped the left one carefully and examined it in the low light. The knuckles were bruised dark, the broken skin already pulling together at the edges, faster than it should have been, faster than I was used to. My wolf, working, making up for 14 years of enforced stillness with the focused efficiency of something that had been waiting a very long time to be useful. I flexed my fingers. It hurt. I did it again. It hurt less. The wolf warmth moved through my hands in response, that slow, steady heat that I was still adjusting to, still half convinced would disappear if I acknowledged it too directly, like light from a star that vanishes the moment you look straight at it. I sat up, re-wrapped both hands loosely, put my bare feet on the cold floor and stood. Someone had been in the room while I slept. I registered this without alarm. There had been no threat in it, no violation of the locked door. The lock was still turned from the inside. But on the chair nearest the fire, where last night there had been only the empty plate, there were now clothes folded with military precision. Dark trousers, a deep grey tunic, a pair of thick socks, and boots that looked as though they had been selected for fit rather than ceremony. I stood and looked at them for a long moment. Then I looked at the locked door, then back at the window, still dark outside, the first suggestion of grey at the edges of the curtain. Then at the clothes. Someone in this castle was very good at moving without being heard. Filed that away. I picked up the boots, turned them over. The sole had barely been worn. These were not borrowed from someone else and repurposed. These were new, or near enough. I got dressed without letting myself think about what it meant, that someone had measured me while I was unconscious and ordered boots that fit. The corridor outside my room was empty. Long, stone-flagged, lit by iron wall sconces spaced wide enough apart that there were pools of shadow between them. The castle had the feel of something very old that had been kept with rigorous practicality. No decorative excess, no softening of the stone with tapestries or painted plaster. What hung on these walls was functional. Weapon racks, mounted maps, the occasional iron hook bearing a guard's cloak abandoned between shifts. I moved quietly. Habit again. 14 years of moving through spaces that did not belong to me had made silence as natural as breathing. I found the staircase at the corridor's end and followed it down, listening to the castle wake around me. The distant percussion of a kitchen beginning its morning work, the creak of a door somewhere below, voices low and purposeful. A building coming online the way a body comes online in the first minutes of consciousness, slowly, in stages, different systems arriving at readiness in their own time. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. The great hall opened before me, enormous, double height, its long tables already being set for the morning meal by 2 young men who moved with the brisk efficiency of people who have done this task so many times it requires no thought. A fire already roaring in the hall's massive hearth, morning light beginning to press through the high, narrow windows, and standing at the far end of the hall, studying a document spread across the high table with the focused attention of someone who had been awake considerably longer than I had, was a woman. She looked up the moment I entered. She was perhaps 30, tall, with the build of someone whose physicality has been trained rather than simply inherited, lean and precise, carrying herself with the easy authority of a ranked wolf who has never needed to announce her rank. Dark auburn hair pulled back severely, eyes the colour of shallow water over grey stone. She looked at me the way a general looks at unexpected terrain. Not with hatred, something more measured than hatred, the immediate assessment of a woman who has learned to identify threats before they become problems. She looked at me, and in the space of 3 seconds I watched her take in the new clothes, the wrapped hands, the bare fact of my presence in a castle where my presence had clearly not been announced to everyone. Her expression settled into something that was not quite pleasant and not quite hostile, and was, I suspected, exactly what she intended it to be. She said I was the woman from the border, the one in the burial shroud. Her voice was flat, informational, confirming facts rather than asking questions. She introduced herself as Lysin, senior war captain of the Ashvale Guard. She said it the way people say things that contain more than the words, a context, a position, a relationship to this place that had been built over years and did not require explanation. I understood her perfectly. Serenova, I told her. Just Serenova. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "For now." Her eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, with the sharpening of someone revising an assessment upward. She folded the document in her hands and set it on the table with the careful deliberateness of a woman who touches things precisely. She told me that he didn't bring people here. In 11 years, he had never brought anyone inside these walls who was not a soldier, a diplomat, or a prisoner. I was none of those things. That should concern me more than it appeared to, she said. It concerns me exactly as much as it should, I replied. She studied me for a long moment. Then something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but the particular reluctant acknowledgement of one measured woman recognizing another. She said breakfast was in an hour, that I shouldn't wander into the East Wing. The war dogs were kennelled there, and they hadn't been introduced to me. She walked past me without another word. I watched her go and understood 3 things simultaneously. That she was formidable, that she had been here long enough to have earned everything she had, and that she had already identified exactly what I represented to the careful architecture of her life in this castle. I did not blame her for any of it. Caelan was in the courtyard. I found him by following the shift in the castle's atmosphere. The way people moved with slightly more deliberateness in one direction, the way the guard's posture adjusted by a degree that was invisible, unless you had spent years reading rooms for safety. I stepped into the courtyard from a side door and stopped at the top of 3 stone steps. He was sparring. Or rather, he was demonstrating. 3 guards in a loose formation around him, wooden training blades, moving at a speed that was not quite full engagement, but was not gentle either. He moved between them with the quiet economy of someone who has been doing this long enough that it no longer requires thought. Reading lines of attack before they arrived, stepping through gaps that appeared and vanished in fractions of seconds, the occasional controlled strike that made the recipient step back sharply and reassess. He had not put on armor for this. He was in the same dark clothing as last night, and this bothered his opponents considerably more than it bothered him. He saw me the moment I appeared at the top of the steps. I know this because of the way he did not react. The controlled non-reaction of a man who has registered something and chosen to continue what he was doing while he decided what to do about it. He said something brief to the guards. They stepped back. He turned and came toward the steps. His face in daylight was different from his face by firelight. Harder, in the sense that daylight is less forgiving than amber flame. Clearer lines, the shadows under his eyes more evident, the quality of his attention more exposed. But the eyes themselves were the same. That dark, specific, measuring regard that had taken me apart and filed the pieces away last night, and was now simply continuing the same process in better light. He looked at the boots. "They fit," he said. "They fit," I agreed. I let a beat pass and then asked how. "He had carried me in," he said simply. He had noticed. He said it with complete simplicity, as though it were the most natural thing, as though a man who made kingdoms nervous had any business paying attention to a stranger's shoe size while carrying her unconscious body through a forest in the middle of the night. My wolf sent a warm pulse through my chest that I absolutely did not acknowledge. I started to tell him there was something I needed, but he cut me off with low certainty. He said there was something I should hear first. And then he was already moving back toward the castle's main door, not waiting for me to follow, assuming it, with the same unhurried certainty that characterized everything he did. I followed. I told myself it was strategic. The council chamber was on the first floor, a long room with a heavy table and 8 chairs, maps covering 2 full walls, the smell of old paper and iron, and the particular tension of a room where difficult decisions are habitual. 3 men were already there when we entered. They rose, not with the anxious scramble of subordinates performing respect for show, but with the practiced, genuine deference of men who had chosen to follow this particular person, for reasons they had thought through carefully. On the table was a letter. Caelan picked it up without sitting, held it out toward me. I took it, read it again. It was written on Sylvain Elder Council official parchment, bearing Marin's formal seal, the silver crescent I had seen pressed into wax on every document that had ever made my life smaller. The language was diplomatic and impeccable, and every word of it was a weapon held at a careful angle. A registered member of the Sylvain Pack, a female Omega, mentally compromised following a self-inflicted incident, may have crossed into Ashvale territory in a state of distress. Under Continental Pack Law Article 7, Clause 3, the Sylvain Council formally requested the safe return of their ward for ongoing goodwill between the territories. I put the letter down on the table. Slowly, carefully. The way you set down something that you do not want anyone in the room to see you handling with shaking hands. The room was very still. Mentally compromised. Self-inflicted incident. Our ward. 14 years of slow poison and deliberate erasure, and she had compressed it into 3 sentences and a seal. Clinical. Satisfied. Exactly as she had looked the morning she gave the order. I asked whether she had sent it that morning. An hour ago, he told me, before sunrise. She knew I was here. She had suspected. She had spies along the border. Most people did. He knew who they were. I looked at the letter one more time. I thought about the legal architecture of it. Continental Pack Law was centuries old, and Marin knew every clause. Registered member, mental compromise, safe return. I was still recorded as a living Sylvain Omega in every official register. Marin had made sure of that. She had buried me privately in the sacred grove with no death recorded. It had been a containment, not an execution. Which meant, on paper, she had every right to ask for me back. and any territory that refused faced a legal dispute that could escalate to the Continental Council and become expensive and complicated. Frankly, more trouble than one escaped Omega was worth. I understood the geometry of my situation completely. I told him I would leave. Not back to Sylvain. I'd go further east, across the... No. The word was quiet. It was not loud enough to interrupt. It simply landed in the room with enough weight that everything else stopped. I looked at him. This letter, he said, had been addressed to him, and he was going to respond to it. He looked at his 3 council members. Something passed between them, a look I couldn't fully read, but which seemed to contain a shared recognition of something. The older man, grey-bearded, who had the look of someone who had advised this particular alpha through many difficult decisions, nodded once, very slightly. Caelan turned to me. Under Continental Pact Law, he said, Article 12, a territorial sovereign could grant asylum status to any individual within their borders who faced documented harm from their territory of origin. Asylum superseded recovery rights under Article 7. And under Ashvale Territorial Charter, the sovereign could additionally designate an individual as a formal ward of the territory, which granted them full territorial protection under international law, irrevocable, without the ward's own consent. The room was completely still. I stared at him and said he was offering me. He said he was telling me what he intended to do. The decision was mine. His dark eyes held mine across the table. No pressure, no performance. Just a man who had made up his mind about something and was now, as promised, waiting for the other party to decide. I thought about Elder Marin's careful seal, her 3 sentences, our ward, appropriate care. I thought about the sacred grove and the sound of celebration filtering down through 6 feet of dark earth. I thought about the door I had locked from the inside for the first time in my life. I told him that he didn't know me. He had found me at his border 2 days ago. Yes, he agreed. This would create a legal dispute with a pack he had no reason to fight, I said. He told me he had fought for considerably less. Why? I asked. The word came out before I could stop it. Raw at the edges, stripped of the careful control I had been maintaining. Why would he do this? What did he get from this? He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was the same as it always was, low and unhurried, carrying no excess. He said that I had looked at his home the previous night, and the first thing I had done was calculate the exit routes. That I had eaten because my body needed it, not because I trusted the food. That I had locked a door he had already told me he would not breach. That I had not asked him for a single thing, not protection, not help, not assurance. I had been self-sufficient in this territory for less than 48 hours, with nothing but a burial shroud and broken hands. He had 800 soldiers in this territory. Every one of them, he said, would be improved by whatever it was that made me the way I am. I stared at him. That was a very practical answer, I said. It was an honest one, he replied. The grey-bearded council member made a sound that might, in another context, have been a cough. I looked at the letter on the table, at Marin's silver seal. Do it, I said. He wrote the response himself. In the same room, at the same table, while his council members dispersed to their respective tasks with the efficiency of men who understood a decided thing when they saw one. I sat near the window, watched the courtyard below, and said nothing. He wrote quickly. He wrote the way he spoke, without waste, without decoration, with the particular precision of someone who has long understood that the most devastating sentences are also the shortest ones. I did not read it over his shoulder, but when he was done, he set it flat on the table for the ink to dry, and I could see the last line from where I sat. The individual you seek is a ward of the Ashvale territory, effective this morning. Any further correspondence on this matter will be treated as a territorial dispute and responded to accordingly. Caelan Drav, Sovereign Alpha, Ashvale. No greeting, no closing pleasantry, no gesture toward the goodwill Marin had referenced. Just a line drawn in ink that was also a line drawn in every other sense. Clear, permanent, impossible to mistake. He folded it, sealed it, handed it to the guard at the door. Then he looked at me. He told me I was angry. I told him I wasn't. I was something more complicated than angry, and I did not have the vocabulary for it yet. He said I hadn't wanted someone else to decide. No, I told him, I hadn't. He nodded once. And then, because apparently this man was constitutionally incapable of softening a thing when the direct version was available, he said he knew. The decision had been mine. I had made it. What he had decided was that I'd have the option. I looked at him for a long time. She'll escalate, I said finally. Yes, he agreed. She'll come here herself, I said. She won't stop at a letter. No, she won't. He moved toward the door. He paused with his hand on the frame, his back to me, and in that moment, I saw the very slight adjustment of his posture, the minute shift of his weight. Thinking about something, deciding whether to say it. He said it. The grove where they buried me, he said, in Sylvain territory, the eastern sacred ground. He asked what my pack's oldest stories called it. I stilled. The hollow place, I said slowly. They said it was where the earth was thin, where the boundary between... I stopped. He turned just enough to see my face. In Ashvale, he said quietly. They called the same grove the binding place. They had called it that for 300 years. His dark eyes held mine for one moment. One single charged moment that landed in the center of my chest like a stone dropped into deep water. Sleep well, Serenova. He was gone. I stood in the council chamber with Marin's letter on the table and the sound of his footsteps fading down the corridor, and a question forming in the base of my mind, slow, enormous, cold with implication, that I was absolutely not ready to ask. My wolf was not sleeping now. She was sitting straight up, ears forward, steady heat pouring through my chest in bright, insistent waves. I know, I told her. I just didn't know what to do with knowing. 3 days passed. I counted them the way I had counted everything in the Sylvain pack, carefully, privately, with the specific awareness of someone who has learned that time is a resource and resources run out. In those 3 days, I learned the shape of Ashvale Castle the way you learn the shape of a place you are trying to understand, rather than simply inhabit. The patrol rotations, precise, overlapping, the product of someone who had thought seriously about where the gaps in a perimeter tend to appear. The kitchen's rhythms, 4 meals a day, no ceremony, food built for endurance rather than impression. The particular hierarchy of the Great Hall at mealtimes, where no one sat in the same seat twice, and yet everyone seemed to occupy exactly the right amount of space for exactly who they were. 140 wolves in this castle. Every one of them watched me with varying degrees of curiosity. None of them approached me uninvited. I did not know whether this was Caelan's instruction or his effect. With him, the distinction was difficult to establish. Solrin grew stronger by the hour. The last residue of the Sylvain poison burned away in steady increments. I could feel it going, like ice melting from a river, the current moving faster underneath with every degree of warmth. By the second morning, I could scent the entire eastern wing from my room. By the third, I could hear a conversation through 2 closed doors and a stone corridor. By the third night, the dark did not feel like the dark anymore. It felt like information. I found the archive on the second day. It was in the castle's oldest section, the North Tower, accessible through a door so low I had to duck, its hinges the dark orange of iron that had been wet and dried 1,000 times. Inside, the room smelled of old paper and cold stone and the undisturbed stillness of a place that people occasionally visit but do not use. Shelves from floor to ceiling, ledgers, maps, bound manuscripts, loose documents in flat wooden boxes. The accumulation of 3 centuries of territorial record. I was not looking for anything specific. I told myself that. I started with the oldest section, the manuscripts bound in dark leather, their spines cracked and faded. Most were records, patrol logs, treaty copies, census tallies, the dry machinery of a territory managing itself. I moved through them efficiently, reading the way I had always read, fast, retaining, filing. I found it in the 4th volume, a manuscript thinner than the others, its pages a different texture, older, more fragile, the ink a darker brown at the edges where it had been exposed to air for centuries. The title in an archaic hand, On the Covenant of the Binding Grove and the Blood of Ashvale. I sat down on the cold floor, pulled the manuscript into my lap, and read. It took me an hour. The language was old, not impenetrable, but careful, the kind of writing produced by someone who understood that the thing they were recording was important enough to deserve precision, and fragile enough to require restraint. I read it twice, the first time quickly for the shape of it, the second time slowly for the weight. The covenant was 312 years old. It had been made at the Binding Grove, the sacred ground that the Sylvain Pack called the Hollow Place, and the Ashvale territory called what it was. A crossroads in the Earth's memory. A place where, the manuscript said, the moon's attention pools like water in a hollow stone, and what is placed there either takes root or is washed away. The covenant was simple in its architecture and vast in its consequence. Once in every generation, not on a fixed schedule, not in any predictable pattern, but at the moon's discretion, a soul was sent. A hollow sovereign. A wolf whose spiritual capacity exceeded the ordinary bounds of what a pack could produce. Not a stronger alpha, not a fiercer warrior, but something categorically different. A vessel for something older. A bridge between the living world and whatever the moon goddess actually was. The hollow sovereign would always be found at the Binding Grove. The Ashvale Alpha of that generation would either receive her, recognize her, shelter her, stand between her and the world while she came into herself, or would not. The ones who had received the sovereign had built this territory into what it was, had ended wars before they started, had lived long and ruled wisely, and died in their own beds surrounded by the people they loved. The ones who had not, the manuscript listed them. 4 names across 3 centuries. Men who had been in the wrong place, or had been blinded by politics, or had simply not understood what they were looking at when she arrived. They had all died within 5 years, always in battle, always violently, always before they had finished what they were building. I turned to the last page. There was a note, newer ink, a different hand, written perhaps 30 years ago. 2 lines only. The grove was visited. The sovereign did not emerge. May the moon forgive this failure, and may the next alpha of this bloodline be wiser than his father. I sat on the cold floor of the North Tower for a very long time. Caelan's father, the man who had stood at the Binding Grove a generation ago and had not understood what he was looking at, or had not been looking at all, who had died in battle before 45, leaving a 22-year-old son to pick up an entire territory with his bare hands and make it what it now was. I thought about Caelan's face when he had asked me what my pack called the Eastern Sacred Ground. He had known. He had known exactly what he had found at his border, and he had not said so. I returned the manuscript to its shelf, replaced it precisely, walked back through the low door into the corridor, and stood there for a moment with my hand flat on the cold stone wall, breathing. My wolf was very still. Not the stillness of suppression, the full, held stillness of an animal who understands that the next few moments are important. A steady warmth in my chest, patient, deep, the warmth of something entirely certain, pressing gently against the inside of my ribs. She already knew. She had always known. I straightened my spine, pulled my hand from the wall, and went to find something to eat, because thinking would keep, and it always kept, and the hunger was immediate and could not be argued with. I found the war room by accident at midnight. I had not been sleeping, another old habit, the body treating rest as a luxury rather than a requirement, staying alert long past the point of usefulness. I had been walking the upper corridors, letting my expanded senses map the castle in its nighttime configuration, when I saw the thin line of light under a door I had not yet opened. I opened it. The war room was large, low-ceilinged, dominated by a table that bore the most detailed map I had ever seen, the entire continent rendered in careful ink, territorial boundaries marked, routes annotated, patrol zones shaded in different colors. Candles burned at the table's four corners, low but steady. The walls held additional maps, elevation surveys, what appeared to be a decade of campaign documentation. I stepped inside and leaned over the table to find Sylvain. I found it quickly. The Sylvain territory was mid-continent, a compact, well-positioned pack holding, unremarkable on paper. The Binding Grove was not marked. Of course it wasn't. The sacred ground of any pack was kept off official maps, a security instinct as old as packs themselves. But I knew the eastern boundary, the river, the old-growth tree line. I placed my finger on the approximate location, and then I began to plan. Marin would come herself. The letter had been a formality, a legal architecture she was constructing before her real move. She would bring the council's formal arbiter, probably 2 or 3 ranked warriors for appearance, and she would make the case in person that I was a mentally unstable pack ward who required supervised return to Sylvain care. She would be calm, precise, dressed in silver crescent gray, and every word out of her mouth would be a blade held at a careful angle. I needed to understand what Caelan would do when she arrived. I needed to understand it, because I could not afford to be surprised by him. Every decision I made about what happened next depended on accurately understanding what he was and what he would do under pressure. I was still studying the map when I heard him. He did not knock. He stepped into the doorway and stopped, and neither of us said anything for a moment. He was wearing what he appeared to sleep in, dark trousers, a loose linen shirt, his feet bare on the stone floor, which struck me as improbably human for a man of his reputation. His hair was uncharacteristically disordered. There were marks at the edges of his eyes that sleep deprivation puts there. He had not been sleeping either. He looked at me standing over his war table, looked at where my finger rested on the map. Then he came into the room, moved around the table's edge to the adjacent angle where he could see the map from a different position without crowding me. He leaned forward, forearms on the table, and said that Marin would come through the northern pass, that it was 2 days faster, and she would want to arrive before we'd had time to establish me fully. I asked how long we had. 5 days, he told me. Maybe 4. We both looked at the map. The candles between us threw our shadows long across the walls. You knew, I said. Not an accusation. A statement placed on the table between us, the way you set down something heavy and let the other person decide whether to pick it up. He was silent for a moment. He told me he had read the manuscript at 15, that his father's advisor had kept it after the elder Drav died, and that he had read everything his father left. He had understood what it meant, and he had spent the next 17 years thinking about what he would do differently if the opportunity arrived. I asked him, "And when you found me?" "Yes," he said. "When he found me, that was when." I studied his profile in the candlelight, the clean line of it, the controlled stillness. I told him he should have told me. "Yes," he agreed, without defense and without explanation. He should have. I asked why he hadn't. A long pause came then. Honest, this time. The pause of someone actually examining their own reasoning rather than constructing a presentation of it. "Because," he said finally, "the covenant requires choice. Mine, specifically. If he had told me what I was before I had come into it myself, before my wolf had recovered enough for me to feel it, he would have been presenting me with a destiny and asking me to step into it. And that," he said, "not different enough from what they had done to me." I went very still. He kept his eyes on the map. "They had taken my choices," he said, "every one of them, for 14 years. He was not going to be another person who told me what I was before I had the chance to find out for myself." The war room was completely silent. Outside, somewhere in the dark, a night bird called once and went quiet. I had several responses to that. I examined each one and found that they all reduced to the same thing, a feeling I did not have language for, pressing against the inside of my chest with the specific, uncomfortable insistence of something that had been locked in a small space for a very long time and had just noticed the door was open. I said none of it. Instead, "She'll bring a legal arbiter," I said. He knew. "Continental Pack Law Article 7, I told him. "She has standing even with the ward designation if she can demonstrate mental incapacity in the original registration. She has 14 years of documented records." "She does," he agreed. He moved to the wall where a secondary map hung, a larger-scale rendering of the 5-territory region. His finger traced a route. "But Article 7, he told me, has a counter-clause that is rarely invoked. If the individual in question can demonstrate active wolf status at the time of the recovery claim, the mental incapacity argument is invalidated. A wolf whose gifts are present and functioning cannot be legally classified as requiring supervised care." I told him my gifts were not, that I didn't even know the full extent of... He cut me off gently. He told me I had destroyed 3 of his best guards in the training yard yesterday morning, before breakfast, without shifting. His voice carried something that was almost amusement. He said I had been observed. I thought about the training yard, the 3 guards who had been running a drill near the eastern wall when I had decided to test my returning reflexes, the way they had looked at me afterward. I told him I had not been trying to make a point. He knew that, he said. That was what had made it effective. He turned from the wall map, and his eyes found mine across the candlelit table. When Marin arrived, he told me, she would want to see me diminished. She had spent 14 years constructing the narrative of what I was. If I stood in front of her continental arbiter as what I actually was, she would have nothing. I thought about standing in front of Marin, about her careful hands and her clinical satisfaction, and her 3 sentences and her silver seal. Something cold moved through me and settled at the base of my spine, like iron. "I can do that," I said. He knew I could, he said, simply, as though it were not a question. The draft from the window found me then, a thin thread of night cold that curled across the back of my neck. I did not shiver, but he moved, one low step, positioning his larger frame between me and the window without looking up from the map, without commenting, without any indication whatsoever that he had done anything at all. I stared at the side of his face. He turned a page in the campaign ledger. I said nothing. My wolf sent a wave of warmth through my chest, deep, spreading, insufferably content. We were still at the table an hour later when the door opened. Lysine stood in the doorway. She was fully dressed, not in sleep clothes, in her work clothes, the dark uniform of the Ashvale Guard's senior rank. She had either not slept or had risen for exactly this, and I could not tell which. Her eyes moved from Caelan to me and back, with a swift, precise economy of a woman doing rapid calculations. Her expression did not change. "The Northern Scouts were back," she said to Caelan. Her voice was perfectly even. The Sylvain party had left their territory 2 hours ago, moving faster than expected. He asked how many. 7, she told him. Elder Marin, 2 arbiters, 4 ranked warriors. And someone else. The scouts couldn't identify the scent, only that it was old, older than any of the others. I felt my wolf go still. Not the recognition still of Caelan's presence, something else, older, colder, the specific alertness of an animal that has scented something it knows to be dangerous. A cold pulse moved through me, not warmth. Ice, pressed outward from the center of my chest like a warning. "The Shadow Council," I said quietly. Both of them looked at me. Marin hadn't worked alone, I told them. She never had. There was someone who had taught her the dark techniques she had used on me, someone who had been operating from behind the Council's authority for years. I looked at Caelan. I believed they were with her. The silence that followed had a different quality from all the silences before it. Lysine stepped into the room. Her composed exterior had cracked by a single degree, enough for me to see what lived underneath it. Not hatred for me, something more complicated and older than that. She looked at me and told me I needed to hear something, not to Caelan, to me. Her gray eyes held mine with the direct, uncomfortable honesty of a woman who has decided to stop being careful. She told me she had known about the Covenant for 6 years, that Caelan had told her when he trusted her with the territory's deepest records, that she had spent 6 years preparing for the possibility that the Sovereign would come, studying what she might be, what she would need. She told me she had said to herself she had made peace with it. She had not made peace with it, she said. It cost her to say it. I could see exactly what it cost her. This woman who had built something real here, who had earned every inch of her standing with her own blood and work and years. She had known a stranger might arrive and rearrange everything she had built herself around, and she had stayed anyway. Had stayed and prepared and done her job magnificently. And then I had appeared at the border in a burial shroud and disrupted the architecture of her life by simply existing. I understood her. More than she probably expected. "I'm not here to take anything from you," I said. She knew that, she said, a little sharply. She was telling me so I understood who was in this room with me. Not an ally by convenience. Not a woman who accepted me because she had no choice. She accepted what I was because she understood what this territory needed, and she was loyal to this territory above everything else. But she needed me to know it had a price, and she was the one paying it. The room was very still. I looked at her, this formidable, precise, honest woman, and felt something shift in my chest. Not warmth exactly, something more complicated than warmth. The specific thing you feel when someone respects you enough to tell you the truth, when a lie would have been easier. "Thank you," I told her, "for that." She looked at me for a moment, then she looked at Caelan. 3 days, she said, not 4. They were moving at a war pace. She turned back toward the door. She paused with her hand on the frame, and in that pause I saw, just briefly, the shadow of everything she was not saying. Then she said it anyway, quietly, precisely, to the room. "For what it's worth," she said, "she was glad it was me." She left before either of us could respond. The candles had burned very low. The map on the table was the same map. The night was the same night. Caelan looked at the doorway Lysine had left through, something private and careful on his face, gone the moment he turned back to the table. "She's been here for 11 years, I said. "Yes. She's extraordinary." "Yes," he said. "She is." I looked at the map, at the Northern Pass route, at the 3 days between now and Marin's arrival. 3 days to understand what I was capable of. 3 days to prepare. 3 days in a locked room that I had chosen to lock myself, in a castle that housed 140 wolves who had watched me with curiosity but not contempt, in a territory that had written my name into its legal protection before it had any practical reason to. 3 days with a man who moved between me and cold drafts without comment, and had waited 17 years to do it correctly, and had given me the option and let me decide. "I'm going to need the manuscript from the North Tower," I said. "It's already in your room," he told me. He had moved it that morning. I stared at him. The shadow of almost amusement crossed his face again, brief, controlled, there and gone like a flame in wind. He told me to sleep, that 3 days was not long. I knew. He moved toward the door, stopped. Serenova. My name in his mouth was different from my name in anyone else's. I did not examine why. I stored it away in the same place I was storing everything else, the boots, the fire, the draft, the manuscript, in the growing collection of things I did not yet know what to do with. He told me, "The Hollow Sovereign chooses. The Covenant requires it. The Alpha receives, but the Sovereign decides whether to be received." He needed me to understand that there was no pressure here. Whatever I decided, whatever I learned about myself, about what this was, it was my choice. All of it. Always. The words landed in my chest the way certain things land, not with a crash, but with a slow, seismic shift. The rearrangement of load-bearing things. I said nothing for a long moment. "Go to sleep, Caelan," I said finally. The almost amusement reached his eyes this time. Just barely. Just for a second. "Good night, Serenova." He was gone. I stood in the war room alone, surrounded by the maps of his territory, the candles burning their last inch, the cold draft coming in from the window with no one to stand between me and it now. I did not move away from it. I stood in it and let myself feel it. The cold, the dark, the vast and complicated weight of what I was becoming. What was coming in 3 days from the north, with 7 wolves and a silver seal, and something old and dangerous that I could not yet name. I do not cry, I reminded myself. But standing there at midnight, in the war room of the most feared territory on the continent, free for the first time in 14 years, chosen rather than buried, I understood for the first time what the people who could cry were crying about. I turned off the last candle and walked back to my room in the dark. The dark felt like information, and the information felt, for the first time, like mine. The morning Maren came. The sky was the colour of iron. I had been awake for 2 hours by the time the Northern Scout's signal reached the castle, a specific sequence of horn calls that meant confirmed arrival, hostile intent, proceed with formal protocol. I had learned the signal system in 3 days, the way I had always learned things that mattered, completely, without being asked to. I was already dressed when Lysin knocked. She opened the door. She looked at me, standing at the window in my darkest clothes. She said one word. Good. That was all. They came through the northern gate at mid-morning. I watched from the upper corridor window as the party crossed the courtyard below. 7, as the scouts had reported. Elder Maren at the front. I would have known her from twice this distance, from the quality of her movement alone. That particular, contained precision. The walk of a woman who has never once hurried, because hurrying implies the possibility of being late, and Maren was never late for anything. She arranged the world around herself so that lateness was structurally impossible. She wore the silver crescent grey of the Elder Council. Of course she did. 2 continental arbiters behind her, official, neutral, their grey and white robes marking their status as representatives of the continental governing body. Pack law made flesh. Behind them, 4 ranked Sylvain warriors, ceremonially armed. And then the 8th. I had not accounted for an 8th. He walked at the rear of the party, slightly apart from the others. An old man, or a man who wore the appearance of old age the way some people wear a coat, chosen for its utility rather than its truth. Thin, pale, moving with a stillness that was not frailty but calculation. Every step deliberate in the way that very powerful things are deliberate when they are choosing not to show their full capacity. His eyes found my window before I could step back. Found it. Held it. With the specific patience of someone who has been looking for something for a very long time and has recently been told exactly where to look. I stepped back. My wolf had gone completely silent. Not the silence of fear, the silence of the deep forest when a predator passes through and everything with sense enough to survive holds its breath. A cold pressure moved through my chest. Not warmth this time. A flat, icy stillness. A warning without words. I moved downstairs. Caelan had arranged the great hall for formal proceeding. The long tables cleared to the sides, the floor open. His council ranged behind him, Lysin at his right shoulder. The hall's fire burning high, built for occasion, for the specific message that this territory was not receiving anyone casually. He stood at the hall's centre rather than his seat. A seated alpha receives petitioners. A standing one meets equals. He was communicating, precisely, that he did not consider this a petition. I came down the main staircase as Maren's party was shown in from the eastern entrance. The timing was not planned. It simply happened that way. I reached the bottom step at the exact moment she crossed the hall's threshold, and the distance between us was perhaps 40 feet of cold stone floor and 14 years. She saw me. Her face did not change. Her eyes did. A single, fractional adjustment that I would not have caught if I had not spent 14 years learning to read the spaces between her expressions for the information she kept there. Surprise. Contained instantly, and something else, very briefly, that I had never seen on Maren's face before, something that might, in a less controlled woman, have been called fear. She looked away. Turned to Caelan with a small, precise nod. What happened next was formal proceeding, the Continental Arbiters doing their work with the efficient ceremony of people who do this regularly and have long since excised any unnecessary drama from the process. The claim was read aloud. I listened to it standing at the edge of the gathered assembly, Lysin beside me, close enough that her shoulder was 2 inches from mine, and I heard my life described in the language of management and correction and studied medical concern, and I felt the cold settle at the base of my spine the way it always did when I was building for something. Mentally compromised, self-inflicted, history of delusional episodes, registered Omega, no documented wolf status, requires supervised return for her own welfare. Every word technically accurate as a piece of documentation, every word a lie as a description of a human being. The senior arbiter finished reading. He looked up with the polite, neutral attention of a man performing a function. He asked whether the individual in question, Serenova Ashcroft, registered Sylvain Pack Omega, was present. "She is," Caelan said. "She is," I said, at the same moment. The arbiter's eyes moved between us. He told me I had the right to address these proceedings directly, under Continental Pack law. Did I wish to do so? "Yes," I said. I moved from the edge of the assembly to the centre of the floor, 40 feet between me and Marin, who stood with her hands folded and her silver crescent seal at her throat, and her expression the clinical patience of a woman who has pre-decided the outcome and is simply waiting for the procedure to confirm it. I looked at the arbiter. "Article 7, Recovery Clause," I told him. "Mental incapacity argument is invalidated in the presence of active wolf status. That's the counter clause." The arbiter blinked. Once. "That was correct," he said. "Then I would like to demonstrate active wolf status," I told him. Marin's composure did not crack, but beside her, the 8th member of her party, the old man, standing slightly apart from the formal grouping, turned his pale eyes toward me, and the quality of his attention shifted in a way that made the hair on my arms rise. The arbiter told me carefully that the demonstration must be witnessed and documented to be admissible. "I understood," I said. I looked at him steadily and asked how much he needed to see. What happened next was not something I had planned. It was something I allowed. There is a difference, and it matters, because I had spent 14 years having things happen to me and having no say in any of them. Every choice I made now, every single one, was a choice, not a concession. I closed my eyes. I reached inward, past the surface awareness, past the new, sharp-edged expansion of healed senses, down to where Solrin lived, where she had always lived, even through 14 years of systematic poisoning. Patient, enormous, furious in the way that ancient things are furious, not hot and consuming, but cold and tectonic, the anger of something that moves slowly and changes everything. "Now," I told her. A surge of pure heat moved through me, vast and immediate, the yes of something that had been waiting years for exactly this. The shift did not hurt. It never had. That had been the lie they told, that it would hurt me, that my body couldn't handle it, that the wolf inside me was a malfunction rather than a gift. Every shift I had been permitted had been supervised, muted, cut short at the first sign of anything beyond the ordinary. I let her come fully. The great hall went absolutely silent. I know what she looked like from the quality of that silence, which is its own kind of record. The silence of 140 wolves, and 7 visitors, and 2 continental arbiters watching something that none of their existing categories could accommodate. She was massive. She was the white of the inside of a closed fist, the white of bone, the white of freshly broken ice, not the pure decorative white of story wolves, but the white of something that has never needed to perform anything for anyone. Her eyes were silver lit from within, the silver of the moon on deep water at full dark. She was not aggressive. She simply stood in the centre of the great hall and existed. And the existing was enough. The senior arbiter had his documentation open. He was no longer writing in it. Maren was looking at me. For the first time since I had known her, since I was 3 years old and she had begun her long, patient, methodical work of making me smaller, Elder Maren Croft looked at me with no calculation in her eyes. Nothing managed, nothing designed. She looked at me the way people look at things that have exceeded all their models. I phased back slowly, stood in the centre of the hall in my human skin, my heartbeat steady, my wolf's warmth still radiating from every pore like the last light of a fire. I looked at the senior arbiter. He looked at me. Active wolf status, he said. Confirmed and documented. Then the recovery claim is invalid, I said. Under Article 7, counter clause, yes. He closed his documentation. The claim is dissolved. It should have ended there. Procedurally, legally, in any logical sequence of events, it should have ended there. Documents closed, claim dissolved, Maren's party shown back to the northern gate. But Maren took one step forward. She said she would like to speak. Not to the arbiter, to the room. Caelan said nothing, which was, I understood, permission. Maren's eyes found mine, and what I saw in them was not what I expected. Not anger, not political recalculation, not the reaching for another lever. What I saw was something that looked, disturbingly, like grief. Old and private and quickly buried, but there for one fractional second before she covered it. What I was, she said, low enough that only the nearest cluster of people could hear, was not a gift. It was not something the moon had given me out of generosity. Hollow sovereigns did not live peacefully. They did not live long. The ones who had come before me, buried, I said, poisoned, suppressed until they were too broken to function, and then disposed of in a sacred grove while their families celebrated. Her jaw tightened. Consumed, she said, by the power they carried, by the people who recognized what they were and used them until nothing was left. She had read the same histories I had now read. Every hollow sovereign who had been received, who had been found and sheltered and allowed to come into her power, had lived 30 years past her natural span and aged 5 times faster than any wolf around her. Burned from the inside. The power was not compatible with a human life. The great hall was very, very still. I felt the weight of what she had said land in the room. Felt it land in Caelan specifically. A slight, involuntary stillness in the quality of his presence at my periphery. I looked at Maren. So your solution, I said, was to bury me alive. Her solution was to contain it, to keep it from igniting. A sovereign who never fully emerged didn't burn. It was not kindness. She had never claimed it was kindness. No, I told her. She had claimed it was care. In a letter to the Continental Arbiters with her silver seal, she had called it supervised care, She asked, and what would I have had her do? For the first time, a crack appeared, not in her composure, but in the foundation beneath it. Tell my parents what their daughter was. Watch the territory mobilize around me. Watch the Ashvale bloodline find me at 17 and begin the process of consuming me before I had lived a single, "That is not your decision to make." Not Caelan, not me, Lysin, standing 2 steps behind me, her voice carrying the cold precision of a blade finding a specific angle. Maren looked at her. No woman, Lysin said, had the right to take 14 years from another woman's life and call it protection. Whatever the cost of what I was, that was my cost to choose, not Maren's to impose. Her grey eyes were flat and final. Maren had not protected me. She had protected her own fear of what I would become. She should say it honestly, at least. The silence that followed was the most complete silence I had ever stood inside. Maren looked at Lysin for a long moment. Then, very slowly, she looked at me. In her face, underneath the composure, underneath the Elder Council's silver and grey, something moved. Not softness, not the crack of a woman breaking open. Something harder and colder than I expected from someone conceding ground. She looked at me the way a general looks at a battle she did not lose by failing to fight hard enough. She had lost because her intelligence was wrong. The information I acted on was incomplete, she said. That is all I will say to this room. What I did believing it was the only available protection. I was not wrong about the threat. I was wrong about the source of it. Not an apology, a tactical statement, delivered with the same precision she brought to everything. She held my gaze for one final moment, and in that gaze was something I recognized, because I had worn it myself. The face of someone who will carry a thing privately and correctly, and never speak of it again. Then she picked up her cloak, turned, and walked out of the great hall with her delegation behind her, spine straight, pace exactly what it always was. Unhurried, because hurrying implies the possibility of being caught, and Maren Croft had never once been caught by anything she had not chosen to face. I turned away. The old man had not moved. He stood at the edge of the assembly, slightly apart, exactly where he had been since they entered. He had watched everything with those pale, patient eyes and said nothing, and the nothing had its own specific weight. He was looking at me now. I looked back. "You haven't introduced yourself," I said. His mouth moved into something that was technically a smile, in the sense that it involved the same facial arrangement. "Varric," he said. "Scholar of the old practices, collector of certain histories." His pale eyes moved across my face with the focused attention of someone cataloging a specimen. "He had hoped to meet me," he said. "He had been hoping to meet me for a very long time." "Why?" I asked. "Because," he said, with the patience of someone who has rehearsed this moment, "in 300 years of recorded sovereign history, there had never been one who clawed her way out of the binding grove herself." He tilted his head. The grove was not merely a burial ground. I knew this now. I had read the manuscript. What the manuscript did not include, because the man who wrote it had not known, was what happens to a sovereign who reaches the grove's activation layer from underneath, rather than above. The room had that quality of air again, the pressure drop feeling, everything alive going still. "The covenant ran in one direction," he continued. "Alpha finds sovereign. Alpha receives. Sovereign chooses." That was the designed sequence. I had been placed in the grove. The grove had activated around me, as designed. But then, instead of waiting to be found, I had activated it from below. I had forced the grove to call rather than receive. In 300 years, no sovereign had ever done that. In 300 years, no sovereign had ever been strong enough to. The silence stretched. "What does that mean?" I asked, carefully. Varric looked at me with those pale, patient eyes, and what lived in them was hunger so old it had forgotten it was hunger and had begun to call itself something else. It meant that I was not simply the sovereign the Ashvale bloodline had been promised. I was the sovereign every bloodline had been promised. And there were 12 other alphas on this continent who would be very interested to learn that I existed. Some of them would come, regardless of what I chose. The question was whether I would be ready when they arrived. The smile remained. It was worse than anything else in the room. He looked forward to our next conversation. He inclined his head and turned toward the door. "Stop him," I said. Caelan was already moving. 2 guards stepped into Varric's path before Caelan's instruction reached them, moving on the alpha's intent before the words, the way trained wolves move when they know their alpha well enough to read a decision a half-second before it is spoken. Varric stopped. He looked at the guards, at Caelan. The smile remained, entirely unbothered. Detaining a continental scholar without cause was a serious diplomatic. Caelan cut him off quietly. Varric had entered this territory as part of a formal pack law delegation. The delegation's claim had been dissolved. His grounds for presence in this territory were now unclear. That seemed like sufficient cause. Varric looked at him. Then he looked at me. How interesting. Not frightened. Recalculating. The smile shifting into something closer to genuine. He was already done, wasn't he? Already decided. His pale eyes moved between us with the detached fascination of a man watching a proof resolve. The Covenant rarely moved this fast. "Take him to the East Tower," Caelan said to the guards. "Treat him well. Feed him. Do not let him leave." Varric was escorted out without resistance, still wearing that smile, still carrying the absolute unbothered patience of a man who has placed a very long bet and is content to wait for the result. The great hall breathed. Maren had not moved. She stood in the centre of the floor with her hands folded and her delegation behind her and the dissolved documentation in the arbiter's hands. And she looked at the door through which Varric had been taken with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Something that looked exactly like relief. "You didn't know," I said. She had known he studied the histories, very quietly. She had not known what he intended. She had used his knowledge. He had let her use it. She had told herself they wanted the same thing. People who let you use them always want something in return. She picked up her cloak, looked at me for one final moment. The manuscript says 30 years past the natural span, burning from the inside. She wanted me to know that when she had made her choices, every one of them, she had believed she was preventing that. She had believed she was the only one who would. She was wrong about the method. She was not wrong about the cost. She turned and left. Her delegation followed. The great hall doors closed behind them. The silence that followed had the quality of a room in which something irrevocable has just occurred, and everyone present is cataloguing what it means for them. I stood in the centre of the stone floor and breathed. My wolf was warm in my chest. Not triumphant, not the heat of a fight won. Something steadier and deeper than that. The warmth of a long, cold thing finally ending. Caelan appeared at my left side, not touching, present, the way he was always present, with that quality of deliberate proximity that was different from crowding and different from distance, and occupied a specific space between them that I did not have a word for. "The East Tower," I said. "He stays until we know what he knows," Caelan said. "And who else knows it?" I nodded. Then, because the room was still full of people, and Marin's words were still in the air, and the weight of 30 years burning from the inside was sitting on my chest with the particular patience of something that was not going to be argued away by willpower alone, I said the only thing I had the capacity to say. "I need to not be in this room." "I know," he said. He moved toward the side door, not waiting, assuming. I followed. The door led to a corridor I hadn't been down before, narrower, older, the stones here showing their age in a way the main castle concealed. At its end, another door, and beyond that, a staircase spiraling up. He opened it. The roof. Cold air hit me like a physical thing, clean and sharp and entirely without agenda, the best kind of cold. The sky above was the same iron gray it had been all morning, but wider up here, the castle walls dropping away in every direction into the dark shapes of the Ashvale forest and the distant silver line of the river and the mountains beyond. I put my hands on the parapet stone and breathed. Behind me, he stood in the doorway and said nothing. The wind came and went. Below, the castle continued its business. I could hear it. The routines of 140 wolves resuming. The post-proceeding recalibration of a place that had just watched something unusual and was now folding it into the ordinary machinery of the day. "The 30 years," I said. He had heard. Did I believe it? I asked. A long pause came. Honest, as always. He believed it was something we needed to understand before we believed or discounted it, he said. He believed Varric knew more than he had said, and he believed that whatever the cost was, it belonged to me. It was my information, my decision. I stared at the horizon. The iron sky was beginning to break at its edges, a thin line of cold light finding the gap between the clouds and the mountains. "She said you'd consume me," I told him. That was what she meant, even if she hadn't said it directly. That being received, being sheltered and protected while I came into what I was, burned through me faster. He knew what she meant. "And?" I asked. He was quiet for a long time, longer than his other pauses, long enough that I turned to look at him. He was looking at the horizon. The breaking light caught the side of his face and showed me something I had not seen there before. Not the controlled, measuring stillness, not the almost amusement. Something unguarded. Something that had the quality of the very rare moments when careful, private people stop performing their carefulness and simply are. "And," he said finally, very quietly, he would rather have whatever time existed honestly than whatever time was possible through management and distance. He turned, met my eyes. That was his answer. The decision was mine. The light was coming through the clouds properly now, pale and cold and clean, the way morning light is in high places, without compromise, without the softening that happens lower down. I looked at him. I thought about 14 years of deliberate erasure, about the warmth of a fire built for that room before its occupant arrived, about boots that fit, about a manuscript moved to a bedside table without comment, about a man who had stood at a window for 17 years, thinking about how to do this correctly, about a door I had locked from the inside, because it was the first one I had ever been offered. I did not cry, but I reached out and put my hand over his, where it rested on the parapet stone. He went very still. The specific, precise stillness of something enormous, trying very hard not to move and displace the thing that has just landed on it. He turned his hand over slowly. His fingers closed around mine, careful, certain, the way he did everything. We stood on the roof of the most feared territory on the continent, with the cold light coming through the iron sky, and neither of us said anything. And the silence was the best silence I had ever stood inside. Below us, the Ashvale forest breathed. My wolf was not flat and watchful anymore. She was standing, her head was high, and for the first time in 14 years, she was home. The morning after the roof, everything was different. In the way that things are different when nothing has visibly changed, but the weight of the air has shifted, and every person in a given space is recalibrating around a new centre of gravity. Caelan was at breakfast before me. He looked up when I came in, said nothing, passed the bread. I sat down and ate and said nothing back. Lysine watched us from the far end of the table with the expression of a woman who has spent 11 years reading this particular man and is now encountering a variable she has no prior data for. She said nothing either. She drank her tea with great focus and the careful, deliberate blankness of someone choosing not to have an opinion. Aldrich, the grey-bearded council member, looked between the two of us and then at the ceiling and then very intently at his bowl. I almost smiled. Almost. I went to the East Tower after breakfast, alone. I had considered telling Caelan and decided against it, not to exclude him, but because whatever lived in Varick's pale eyes and patient smile was mine to face first. He had looked at me in the great hall with that specific hunger, and I needed to understand what he wanted before I decided what to do about it. The guard at the tower door stepped aside without being asked. I noted this, filed it in the growing collection of small signals that this territory had been sending me since I arrived, the collective, unspoken language of 140 wolves deciding what I was to them. Varick was sitting at the small table by the East Tower window when I opened the door, a cup of tea at his elbow, a book open in his lap. He looked up with the settled expression of a man who had been expecting this visit and had been comfortable waiting. He said my name pleasantly. I sat in the chair opposite him, put my hands flat on the table, looked at him. "Tell me about the 30 years, I said. He closed his book, set it down with deliberate care of someone who respects objects, picked up his tea, looked at me over its rim. Then he set the tea down and told me. What Marin had read, he said, was accurate as a record, inaccurate as an interpretation. The sovereigns who had deteriorated, who had burned through their natural span and aged rapidly and died early, were sovereigns who had emerged without completing the covenant, who had been found by their bonded alpha and then separated, or who had emerged alone into circumstances that prevented the bond from forming. The power, he said, is designed to be shared. The sovereign carries the spiritual capacity, the bonded alpha carries the grounding. Without the grounding, yes, the current has nowhere to distribute, it runs through the vessel alone. Eventually the vessel burns out, I said. Eventually the vessel burns out, he agreed. But the historical records Marin had accessed did not include the complete covenant documentation. The complete documentation, which had been in the Ashvale archive for 2 centuries, which Caelan Drav had read, which Varick himself had read, was very clear on this point. He looked at me. A fully bonded sovereign does not burn, he said. She flourishes. The bond is not a vulnerability. It is the design. The East Tower was very still. I looked at him. You knew this, I said. You knew it when you taught Marin the suppression techniques. When you guided her toward the burial decision. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, not denying. "Why?" He turned his cup on the table, around and around, slow and deliberate, his eyes on the movement rather than on me. He had spent 40 years studying the old practices, he told me. The dark techniques, the binding suppressions, the slow poisons. Every technique required a subject. Every theory required a proof. An isolated, suppressed sovereign, deteriorating slowly, the power burning through unchecked, was the most complete proof available of the Covenant's mechanism. He had needed to understand how it failed in order to understand how it worked. His voice was even, scholarly, the voice of a man describing an experiment. I sat with that for a moment. The fury was there, vast, cold, tectonic. The 14 years of it. But I had been carrying this particular anger for long enough that I knew its shape, and I knew that responding from inside it would give him something he could use. He had let Maren believe she was protecting me, I said. He had given her an incomplete truth, and let her build a 14-year atrocity on top of it. Yes. And Maren, when she said she believed she was preventing my deterioration, she had believed exactly what he had allowed her to believe, he said. For the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not guilt, not quite. The look of a man confronting the full accounting of a thing he has kept in his peripheral vision for a long time, and is now being required to look at directly. She was not a good woman, but she had acted in accordance with the information she had. He had chosen what information she had. I looked at him for a long, still moment. "The 11 alphas," I said. He nodded. They would know by now. He had colleagues, researchers, historians, positioned across the continent. When a sovereign emerged, the network activated. It was not malicious. It was documentary. Some of those alphas would come out of curiosity, some out of territorial calculation. A fully bonded sovereign increased her alpha's strategic position considerably, and there were those who would want to understand what that meant for the balance of power. And some, he said, would come because the Covenant calls to bloodlines that carry it, and they would not entirely understand why they were moving until they arrived. "Are any of them dangerous to me specifically?" I asked. 3, possibly, he said. He would give me their names, their territories, their resources, their histories. He leaned back in his chair with the air of a man who has arrived at the part of the negotiation he has been steering toward. In exchange for his freedom. I looked at him. He would give me everything, I said. Every name, every network contact, every piece of documentation he had on the sovereign histories, the deterioration research, and the Covenant mechanics. He would give Caelan copies of every correspondence with every colleague in his network. And he would go back to his scholarship and his research, and he would never again use a living person as his proof of concept. I held his eyes. In exchange, I would not burn his life's work to the ground. The pause was longer this time. Varric looked at me with those pale eyes. The hunger in them had shifted, not gone, but changed in quality. The way hunger changes when it encounters something that exceeds its capacity to consume. He was quiet for a breath. 2. "You believe you can contain the network without me," he said. His voice was measured, not defensive, testing. He was assessing whether I had actually thought it through, or whether I was bluffing with certainty I did not have. I have 3 names and 30 years of correspondence, I told him. I have Caelan Drav's resources and Aldrich's archive instincts, and the singular advantage that none of your colleagues know yet what I am capable of. I do not need to contain your network, I said. I only need to be more expensive than you are worth. He tilted his head, the exact bird-like precision of a man recalculating in real time. You would actually do it, he said. Not a question, not admiration. The flat recognition of someone confronting a variable they had not correctly weighted. I held his gaze. I have already done harder things this week, I told him. The pale eyes held mine for a long, still moment, something that looked, reluctantly and genuinely, like respect. Agreed, he said. He spent 3 hours with Aldrich and 2 of Caelan's most senior advisors, talking with the efficiency of a man who has kept meticulous records his entire life and is now handing them over in full. Names, locations, network maps, 30 years of correspondence condensed into the kind of precise summary that only someone who has thought about nothing else is capable of producing. I sat in on the first hour, then I left. I walked the castle until I found myself in the North Tower, standing in front of the shelf where the manuscript lived. The space where it belonged was empty. The manuscript was still in my room, on the bedside table where Caelan had put it. I sat down on the cold floor. The complete Covenant documentation, which Caelan had read, which Varric had confirmed, was in the Ashvale archive. I had not found it in my 3 days of reading because I had not known to look for a second volume. There was a second volume. There is always a second volume. I did not need to read it to understand what it would say. A fully bonded sovereign does not burn. The bond is not a vulnerability. It is the design. I sat with that in the cold of the North Tower and let it settle through me the way true things settle, not with a crash, but with the patient, inevitable weight of something finding its correct level. 14 years. She had taken 14 years from me, based on a misunderstanding that one additional document would have corrected, based on an incomplete truth that a measured old man had cultivated in her like a plant, watered regularly, pruned into exactly the shape he needed. I thought about Marin's face in the great hall, the grief I had seen, briefly, before she covered it. The I was wrong delivered with the same precision she brought to everything. I thought about what it must be like to discover, at the end of a long and careful life of terrible decisions made in genuine conviction, that the conviction was wrong. I did not forgive her. Forgiveness was not a thing I had available in this moment, and possibly would not have available for a long time. But I filed it, as a fact, as information, as a piece of the accounting that I was going to have to do eventually with everything that had happened to me. The accounting would come later, not today. Today I had something else to do. And there was a thing I needed to sit with first, before I did it. I pressed my back against the North Tower shelf and held still, because here was the truth of it, unvarnished and cold in the way that the most important truths always are. I still did not know, with absolute certainty, what choosing the bond would cost. Varric said one thing, the second volume said another. But Varric had also constructed an entire intellectual career on incomplete truths offered at precise angles. And the second volume had been written 300 years ago by a man who may have had every reason to believe what he wrote, and still may have been wrong. The possibility that Marin was right, not about the method, not about the choice she had made for me without my consent, but about the cost. That possibility was real. It was not a thing I could argue away with willpower. Solrin was very warm in my chest, patient, still, not pushing me toward anything, simply present, the way she had been present through 14 years of suppression, waiting without urgency for me to arrive at the thing she already knew. I turned it over, lived inside it, felt what it would mean if choosing him meant the warmth ran faster, the years moved differently, the span of what I had ahead compressed in exchange for the depth of what it contained. And then I thought about the alternative. 14 more years of moving through places that did not belong to me, calculating exits, trusting no one. The hunger never acknowledged because acknowledged hunger is dangerous. An entire life lived at the edge of other people's warmth, never at the center of my own. I had been buried once. I was not going to bury myself. Whatever the cost of this was, it was mine to pay, mine to choose. And I was choosing it with my eyes open, which was more than anyone had ever offered me before. I got up, straightened my spine. Today I had something to do. I found Caelan in the courtyard, not sparring this time, standing at the well in the courtyard center, reading through what appeared to be Varric's documentation, his expression the focused, analytical stillness of a man processing tactical information. He looked up when he heard me cross the stone. I stopped in front of him. "The second volume," I said. "It's in my study," he told me, "on the desk." He had put it there that morning. I stared at him. "When were you going to tell me?" "When I was ready to read it," he said. I had read the first volume 3 days ago. I had needed time to sit with it before the second volume changed what I understood. He had judged, he said, that today was the right time. "How?" I asked. "Because yesterday I had put my hand over his on a parapet," he said simply. "And I was not a woman who did things before I was ready." I looked at him for a long moment. "I hate how often you're right," I said. The almost amusement reached his eyes fully this time. Not almost. Present. Complete. The real version. The one that changed his whole face briefly and completely, and was gone before it could be catalogued. "Tell me what the second volume says," I said. He folded Varric's documentation, set it on the well's edge. "Look at me." "The bond completes the circuit," he said. "The sovereign carries the current, the alpha grounds it. Together," he paused, choosing words with his usual precision. "Together, the load distributes. The covenant was never designed for one person to carry. It was designed for two." His dark eyes held mine. "The deterioration Marin feared is real. It happens to sovereigns who emerge alone, who carry it alone. The bond prevents it. That is not an accident. That is the point." I breathed. "And the completing of the bond," I said. "The covenant. What does it require?" "Choice," he said. "On both sides. Freely made. That is all it has ever required." I read the second volume in the afternoon. It was shorter than the first, thinner, denser, written in a more recent hand. Clearer. The language of someone who understood what they were recording and wanted it to be understood correctly. The bond between a sovereign and her alpha was not like an ordinary mate bond, the click and lock of the moons matching, the biological imperative that most wolves experienced as something that happened to them. This was something older and more deliberate. It contained the mate bond. It was built on it, rooted in it. But it exceeded it in the way that a river exceeds its source spring. It required Solrin to choose his wolf, fully, without the reservation of survival, to extend her recognition and allow herself to be known completely in return. For a woman who had spent 14 years making herself invisible, who had mastered the art of revealing nothing, of existing at the margins of notice, of being known by no one because being known had never once been safe. The requirement was specific and personal, and more frightening than anything Marin had ever done to me. To be known completely, to be received. I sat with the second volume in my lap until the afternoon light moved across the floor and the fire burned down to coals. Then I set it down, got up, and went to find him.
He was in his study, working. A map spread across the desk, annotations in his precise hand, the everyday machinery of running a territory that 3 kingdoms paid tribute to. He looked up when I came in, took one look at my face, put down his pen. I closed the door. "I need to tell you something," I said. He waited. I crossed to the chair across from his desk and sat in it, put my hands on my knees, looked at the grain of the wood between us, and then at him. "I don't know how to be received," I told him. "I have never been received. I do not know how to be fully known by another person and trust that the knowing won't be used against me. I do not know how to stop calculating exits. I do not know how to be in a place and not be simultaneously planning how to leave it." I held his gaze. "I want you to know that before anything else. Whatever I am in the histories, whatever the covenant says about what I'm capable of, this specific thing, I am not good at. And I thought you should know." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was as even as always, low and unhurried, carrying no excess. "He was 41 years old," he said. "He had run this territory since he was 22. He had had exactly 3 conversations in his life that he would describe as honest, and none of them had been with someone he was not about to lose. He did not know how to be soft. He did not know how to not read a room for threats before he read it for anything else. He did not know how to want something without immediately constructing contingencies for the version of events where he didn't get it." His dark eyes held mine. "We are both very poorly equipped for this," he said. "Yes," I said. And yet, I agreed. The study was hushed. Outside, the Ashvale forest breathed. "I have been here for 8 days," I said. "Yes, 8 days is not a long time." "No. And I have read a manuscript that says the covenant requires my choice, and that choice is permanent and changes the fundamental terms of everything that follows." "Yes." I looked at him. He looked at me. "Caelan," I said. "Yes." "Stop being so maddeningly calm about this." Something broke across his face, not the almost amusement, not the controlled almost expression. Something real and unguarded and sudden, there and gone like light through a gap in the clouds. Something that looked like relief, and also like the specific, private joy of a man who has been very patient for a very long time and has just been told his patience was not wasted. He stood up, came around the desk, crouched in front of my chair so that his eyes were level with mine, not looming, not performing, not demonstrating height or breadth or any of the 100 things a man of his reputation might have used in this moment. Just level, just present. Just him. "Serenova," he said. His voice, finally, was not entirely steady. I looked at him. "He had been waiting," he said quietly, "since he was 15 years old and read a manuscript in a cold archive about an ancient covenant he did not know if he would ever be called to fulfill. He had been careful and he had been patient, and he had built this territory into something worth offering. And then he had found me in the dark at his border, in a burial shroud, half dead, and I had been the least frightened person he had ever encountered. And everything he had been measured and patient about had resolved into one single, clear decision. "Stay," he said. Not as a ward, not as a sovereign, as his mate, as the person this territory was built to shelter. He looked at me with those dark, steady eyes. That was what he was asking. I looked at him for a long time. I do not cry, I had told myself for 22 years. I had kept that promise through the burial, through 8 days of slow recalibration, through Marin's gray silk and Varric's pale eyes, and the weight of a manuscript that contained the truth of what had been done to me and why. I had kept it. I did not keep it now. Not sobbing, not the collapse of someone breaking. One tear from the left eye, quiet and involuntary and completely beyond my control. I felt it happen. I looked at him, and I did not look away. He reached up slowly, caught it with his thumb. His hand remained at the side of my face, warm and careful and entirely certain. "Yes," I said. My voice was steady. "Yes." The covenant did not arrive like a lightning strike. It arrived like dawn, slowly, from the edges first, light finding its way into places that had been dark for a very long time. His wolf and Solrin met in the space between us, not a collision, not the desperate, frantic meeting of two things that have been kept apart. This was something older and slower than that. Two enormous, ancient things turning toward each other across a distance that had always been closing, and now, finally, arriving at zero. Solrin did not circle, did not test, did not approach with the guarded steps of a wolf who has been betrayed enough times to know the cost of trust. She had never been afraid of him, not from the moment she heard his howl in the forest and went still with certainty, not from the moment she carried the word mate across 14 years of dark, like a stone she had been holding, waiting to set down. She walked forward. She pressed her forehead against his wolf's, and she stayed there. And his wolf, this massive, dark thing that had been building a territory, reading manuscripts, carrying the weight of a father's failure and a covenant's silence for 17 years, leaned into her and closed his eyes and breathed. He closed his eyes. The bond settled into place with the feeling of a door you have been standing outside your entire life, finally swinging open from the inside. Not dramatic, not a strike of lightning. The way real things arrive, the way warmth arrives after cold so deep and so long you have forgotten what warmth was. And then it comes, and every part of you remembers at once. The warmth moved through me not like heat, but like light. It did not start from one place. It started everywhere simultaneously, from the base of every bone, from the end of every nerve, from the cold, carved-out spaces that 14 years of deliberate erasure had hollowed into me and left empty. Not filling them, not pretending they were never there. Warming them, bringing them back into the inhabited world. Because warmth does not demand you perform recovery. It simply ensures you do not have to live in the cold alone. I felt him. Not his thoughts, not that precise. His presence. The unmistakable signature of a soul that has been running an entire territory for 20 years on patience and precision and the kind of controlled competence that looks, from the outside, like distance, and is, from the inside, the opposite of distance. The iron, steady discipline of someone who cares about everything and has learned not to let it show in ways other people can use. He was not cold. He had never been cold. He had been waiting. His fangs at my neck were the last thing, not violent, not acclaiming in the old aggressive sense. Gentle. Certain. Irrevocable the way all chosen things are irrevocable, because choice is the only seal that cannot be broken by someone else's hand. The mark settled into my skin with a brief, bright clarity of pain,
and then opened into something else entirely. Not the absence of pain, its transformation. The way a storm becomes a clearing, and the air afterward is cleaner than the air before. I felt the territory, the forest beyond the walls, the mountains at its back, the river at its edge, the stone under the boots of 140 wolves who were, right now, in this exact moment, pausing in their work, the way wolves pause when something fundamental shifts in a pack's center of gravity, without being told, without knowing why. Simply feeling the ground settle after something deep below it moves. The territory knew. He pulled back slowly. His forehead came to rest against mine. His breathing was unsteady. This man whose breathing I had never seen disturbed by anything, by anyone. Unsteady and warm against my face. I had not thought I would ever see him unsteady. I found I liked it very much. More than I had words for.
Serenova, he said. My name in his mouth was different now, deeper, resonant with the bond, carrying something it had not carried before. I know, I said. You're staying. I said yes, Caelan. I know, he said. He knew. His arms came around me, careful and enormous and entirely certain. He stopped. Let the silence have it. The specific silence of a man who has run out of the language of precision and has arrived at something that only exists beyond words. I tucked my face against his neck, felt the steady, powerful beat of his pulse against my forehead. Solrin settled, deep, warm, complete. The contented stillness of a wolf who has been running for a very long time and has finally come home. Yes, I told her. Yes. 3 weeks later, I stood on the parapet roof in the early morning and watched the Ashvale forest come alive in the pale light. My wolf was not silent. She had not been silent since the covenant completed. She hummed, a constant low warmth, the way a fire hums when it has good wood and a proper draw, and no one is asking it to be anything other than what it is. My hands had healed. I had tested them in the training yard every morning. The guards had stopped being surprised, which I took as a sign of progress. Lyson had joined me on the third morning without announcement, positioned herself across from me, and we had sparred for 40 minutes with a focused, mutual respect that was its own kind of beginning. She was extraordinary. I told her so. She told me I telegraphed left before I committed right, and that I should fix it. I was fixing it. Varric had gone. The East Tower was empty. His documentation was in the Ashvale archive, copied and indexed by Aldrich with the thoroughness of a man who understands that certain information needs multiple custodians. 2 of the 11 alphas had already sent formal letters. Caelan had read them, handed them to me, and waited for my assessment. I had given it. He had incorporated it into his responses without alteration. Aldrich had observed this exchange with an expression of profound and private satisfaction that he absolutely did not comment on. Marin's silver crescent seal sat in a box in my room. I had not decided what to do with it. I was not in a hurry to decide. The decision would come when it was ready. The sun was clearing the mountain peaks now, properly up, the iron sky that had hung over the castle for days, finally breaking into something cleaner and colder and full of winter light. The door behind me opened. I had heard him coming from 2 corridors away. He came to stand beside me at the parapet. His arm found its way around my shoulders, the way it had begun to do, with the ease of something that has decided it belongs there and has no further questions about it. Aldrich wants to schedule the formal territorial announcement, he said. I know, I told him. He had told me that morning. A pause. What did I tell him? I told him next week. I wanted to write to Lyson's family first. She deserved to have her people here. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that had been her request. She hadn't thought I know she didn't think I'd think of it, I said. That's why I'm doing it. His arm tightened slightly, the smallest, most deliberate degree. Below, the castle was waking, the training yard coming alive with the sounds of a morning patrol, the kitchen fires sending their white breath into the cold air, the routine percussion of 140 wolves beginning their day in a territory that had been built over 20 years into something worth protecting. I had been buried in warm earth. I had clawed my way out with broken hands and no shoes and nothing but fury, and a wolf who had been waiting 14 years to tell me what she was. I had walked through a forest in the dark, in a burial shroud. I had arrived, half dead and wholly furious, at the border of the most feared territory on the continent. And the most feared man on the continent had cleaned my hands and built a fire and moved a plate 2 feet closer to the warmth, without comment. She does not crawl out. That is what I had told myself in the sacred grove, pressing my palms against the dark. She erupts. I had not known then what erupting would look like, what it would feel like when the power had somewhere to go, when the wolf had someone to run beside, when the cold had a specific person who noticed it every time without being asked. I looked at the mountains, at the pale winter light coming clean and cold off the peaks.
I do not cry, I reminded myself. I had cried once, in a study on a chair. I thought that was probably sufficient for a lifetime. Caelan turned his face toward mine. I thought about the one tear in the study in the afternoon light. 1 tear in 22 years. That seemed exactly right. Cold, he said. I looked up at him, at the dark eyes and the controlled face and the slight, devastating warmth that lived underneath everything he showed the world. You already know the answer to that, I said. He turned me toward him slowly, with the unhurried certainty of a man who has waited 17 years and is no longer in any hurry at all. The winter light fell across both of us. Yes, he said. I do. And because she was home, for the first time in 22 years of holding every feeling at a controlled distance, so was I. We stayed there for a long time, in his study, in the pale afternoon light, in the silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that has no need of it. The Ashvale forest breathed outside the window. Below us, in the courtyard, a guard changed his route slightly without knowing why. And the territory, ancient and sovereign and built over 20 years of patience and sacrifice, settled into its new shape. The shape it had always been reaching toward. The shape it had been designed 300 years ago to eventually hold. 2 halves of a circuit, finally closed. If this story held you from the first line to the last, if Serenova's voice is still in your head, if Caelan's silences hit harder than most men's speeches, then you are exactly the kind of listener Noctaria Tales was built for. Subscribe. Turn on your notifications. The next story is already waiting in the dark. And trust me, you are not ready for what comes next.